The Arizona sun was a hammer, beating the rust-colored land flat and cooking the air until it shimmered. Inside the rail car, the heat was a physical presence, thick with the sweat of immigrants and the smell of coal dust and cheap whiskey. Cole Maddox watched the world burn past the window, a blur of skeletal saguaro and rock formations that looked like the bones of forgotten giants. He was a man, made of stillness. His body settled into the hard wooden bench in a way that suggested he could sit there until the wheels rusted off the tracks. His face, weathered and mapped with lines that spoke of too much sun and too little joy, was impassive. He had sought out this emptiness, this land of blistering days and cold, silent nights. It was a place big enough to get lost in, and he had a past worth losing. The train jolted, its rhythmic clatter a lullaby for the weary. Across the aisle, a mother shushed a crying baby. A few rows ahead, two prospectors argued in low, grumbling tones. It was a capsule of humanity hurtling through a void, each soul carrying its own quiet desperation. Cole's was an old and familiar weight, a ghost that sat beside him, invisible to all but himself. He had made a peace of sorts with it, a truce built on isolation and hard labor. His ranch was his fortress. A small patch of defiant life rested from the desert's grip. And the boy, Jesse, was his anchor to the present. He had no room for other people's trouble. Then trouble found him. It came in the form of a young woman, moving down the aisle with a hurried, furtive grace. She was not dressed for this heat or this journey, her city dress wilted and smudged with grime. Her face was pale beneath a dusting of freckles, her eyes wide and intelligent, but shadowed with a fear so profound it was almost a scent. She stopped at his row, her hands clenched together at her waist. He could see the slight tremor in them. She leaned in, her voice a dry whisper that barely carried over the train's clamor. "Sir," she breathed, her gaze darting towards the door at the far end of the car. "May I slip under your coat?" Cole did not move his head, but his eyes, the color of faded denim, shifted to meet hers. It was a foolish, desperate request. His coat, a heavy canvas duster, lay folded on the seat beside him. It offered concealment, but it was a flimsy shield against whatever chased her. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 35 years, was to say no. To shake his head and turn back to the window, leaving her to her fate. He had buried the man who got involved, buried him deep. But then he saw the flicker of something in her eyes beyond the fear. Resolve, a hard, unbending core of it. She was not begging for pity. She was asking for a tactical advantage, however slight, and in that moment, the ghost beside him stirred. He said nothing. He simply lifted the corner of the duster. It was all the invitation she needed. She slid onto the bench, impossibly small, and curled herself into the space between him and the wall, pulling the heavy fabric over her shoulders. Cole settled the duster back into place, arranging it so it looked like a carelessly tossed garment. From the aisle, she was invisible. He could feel the faint, terrified beat of her heart against his side. He turned his gaze back to the window, his expression unchanged, the stillness returning to his frame as if it had never been disturbed. He did not ask her name or her trouble. Questions were bonds, and he had sworn off chains of any kind. The train whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry, not a signal for a crossing. It was a signal for a stop, out here in the middle of nowhere. The rhythmic clatter slowed, replaced by the grating squeal of metal on metal. The prospectors quieted. The mother clutched her baby tighter. Unscheduled stops meant one of two things: a problem with the tracks or a problem with the passengers. The problem came through the forward door. 4 men, their faces hard and impatient. 3 were rough-looking men in range clothes, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. The 4th was a man who carried himself with an air of oily authority, dressed in a suit that was too fine for the territory and already showing dark patches of sweat. This was Barlow Kane, a name that traveled up and down the new rail line, a name synonymous with ruthless expansion and broken promises. Cole knew the type. Men who saw land not for what it was, but for what it could be worth once they scraped the people off it. "Afternoon, folks," Kane announced, his voice loud and condescending. "Just a brief security check. Conductors misplaced a bit of company property. We'll be on our way shortly." His men began to move down the aisle, their eyes scanning faces, their hands ready. They were not looking for property. They were looking for a person. Cole felt the woman beside him flinch, a tiny, bird-like movement. He remained still as stone. One of the hired guns stopped at their row. This one was different. He was leaner than the others, with a predator's coiled energy. His face was a roadmap of bad decisions, a thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow. His name was Mac Doran, and the moment Cole saw him, the desert outside the window ceased to exist. The past was no longer a ghost. It was here, breathing the same hot, stale air. Doran's eyes swept over Cole, lingering for a half-second before dismissing him as just another broke rancher. His gaze fell on the duster. He reached out a hand to shove it aside. "Just checking the baggage, friend," Doran said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. As his hand moved, his sleeve pulled back, exposing the weathered skin of his wrist, and there it was. A brand, faded but unmistakable, a coiled rattlesnake with a single star in its eye, the mark of the Cimarron Raiders. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in Cole's gut. The world narrowed to that mark. He saw not the crowded rail car, but moonless nights, heard not the chugging of the locomotive, but the whisper of a knife being drawn from a sheath. He smelled not coal smoke, but gunpowder and blood. He had worn that same mark once, a lifetime ago. He had burned it from his own skin, but the scar remained, a pale, puckered reminder of the man he used to be, a man who rode with the likes of Mac Doran. Cole's hand moved, not towards his gun, but to rest on the duster, his fingers pressing down lightly. It was a simple, possessive gesture, an act of claiming. "It's just a coat," Cole said, his voice quiet but carrying a new edge, a flat finality that made Doran pause. Doran's eyes narrowed, recognition dawning not of Cole's face, but of his tone. He knew the sound of a man who had reached his limit. He looked from Cole's cold, steady gaze to the unmoving duster, then back again. For a long moment, the two men were locked in a silent battle of wills, a confrontation invisible to everyone else in the car. It was a conversation held in a language of violence and memory that only they understood. Kane was growing impatient. "What is it? Doran, find something." Doran slowly straightened up, his hand dropping away from the coat. "Nothing." He grunted, a flicker of something uncertainty, perhaps, or a sliver of old fear in his eyes. Just another homesteader. He moved on, his shoulders tight with unspoken frustration. Cole did not relax until the four men had swept through the car and exited through the rear door. A few moments later, the train lurched forward, resuming its journey, the rhythmic clatter returning like a steadying pulse. The woman beneath the coat did not move for a long time. When she finally stirred, it was with a quiet, shaky sigh of relief. She pushed the heavy fabric away from her face, her eyes finding his in the dim light. They were filled with a mixture of gratitude and raw fear. She had no idea how close she had come, or that the man who had saved her had just been confronted by a demon from his own past. Cole's mind was reeling. He had come to this desolate land to bury his sins, to build a life so quiet and unremarkable that his past would never find him. He had fenced his land, built his house, and taken in a lost boy, constructing a fragile peace one day at a time. Now, in the space of 10 minutes, a woman with frightened eyes and a man with a snake tattoo had torn it all down. His carefully built walls were breached. He could feel the old instincts stirring, the cold watchfulness, the muscle memory of violence. He wanted to push her away, to tell her to get off at the next stop and take her trouble with her. But he looked at her, her face smudged with dirt, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror, and he saw the same thing he saw in himself, a person running from something they thought they could never escape. His conscience, the part of him that Jesse's innocent presence had coaxed back from the dead, would not let him. The train whistle blew again, this time for the dusty collection of buildings that was Drybell, not his stop. His ranch was another 15 miles of hard walking from a watering post 2 hours down the line. He stood up, his movements stiff. He grabbed his worn saddlebag from the rack above. The woman looked up at him, her expression turning to one of alarm. "Where are you going?" she whispered. "My stop is not for a while," he said, his voice low and rough. He looked toward the front of the car, then the back. Kane's men were gone, but they would not give up. They would be waiting at Drybell, or the next town after that. The railroad was a giant, methodical beast, and its tentacles were everywhere. "But I reckon this is where we get off." He did not wait for her agreement. He moved toward the rear of the car, to the platform between the carriages. The wind whipped at him, hot and full of grit. He looked back. She was right behind him, her eyes wide but her jaw set. That resolve was still there. "It's moving fast," she said, her voice raised to be heard over the noise. "It will be moving faster soon," he replied. He looked down at the blur of the railroad ties and the gravel rushing past. "When I go, you follow. Land on your feet and roll. Keep your head down." He did not offer his hand. He did not offer words of comfort. He simply offered a chance. He swung himself over the railing, hung for a second, and let go. He hit the ground with a practiced thud, bending his knees and rolling through the impact, coming up on one knee in a cloud of dust and sun-baked earth. A moment later, she followed. She landed awkwardly, tumbling into the scrub brush, but she was quick to her feet, her dress torn at the hem. They stood there for a moment, watching the train recede, a black snake slithering away across the vast, indifferent desert. They were alone. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind. He looked at her, this stranger who had dragged his past into the light. She looked back, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He saw the ledger tucked into the bodice of her dress, the corner of it peeking out. He saw the determination in her eyes that warred with her fear. He saw trouble, and plenty of it. But he also saw that he had already chosen his side. "My ranch is this way," he said, turning his back on the iron rails that represented a power he could not fight. "It is a long walk." Without another word, he started walking, his long strides eating up the dry ground. After a moment's hesitation, she hurried to catch up, a small, defiant figure against the immense, unforgiving landscape. The walk was a silent pilgrimage through a world bleached by the sun. Cole set a relentless pace, and Ada Grace followed without complaint, her city shoes ill-suited for the treacherous ground. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, stealing the moisture from their breath. By the time the ranch came into view, a small cluster of weathered buildings huddled against a low mesa. The sun was a fiery smear on the horizon, and Ada felt as if she had walked her entire life away to get there. It was not much, a small, sturdy house of adobe and wood, a barn that leaned with a stubborn resilience, and a web of fences that looked like stitches holding the parched earth together. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. As they approached, the front door opened and a small boy came out, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was no more than 7, with a shock of sandy hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. He stopped on the porch, his expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Cole," the boy said, his voice clear and high. "Supper is getting cold." Then his eyes fixed on Ada. "Who is she?" "This is Miss Grace," Cole said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "She'll be staying a while." Her stage was held up. It was a thin lie, but the only one he could offer. "This is Jesse." Jesse looked from Cole's grim face to Ada's dusty and disheveled form. He was a boy who had learned to read the silences, and the silence here was heavy. But he offered a small nod. "Ma'am, there is stew." That first night, they ate with the exhaustion of refugees. Jesse asked no more questions. Sensing the fragility of the situation, Ada ate what was put in front of her. The simple stew more satisfying than any meal she could remember. After, Cole showed her to a small, spare room with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto an ocean of stars. He left a bucket of water by the door. "The lock on the door is new," he said. And then he was gone. She understood. It was not to lock her in, but to let her feel safe from the world outside. That night, she slept a dead, dreamless sleep, the first in many weeks. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. It was a life of ceaseless, repetitive work. Cole was gone before dawn, his presence a quiet, solid force mending fences that the wind and heat conspired to break, clearing rocks from a field he hoped to plant, his hands and back in a constant argument with the unforgiving territory. Ada, in turn, found her own purpose within the four walls of the small house, the kitchen, which had been a place of simple function for Cole and Jessie, slowly transformed. She found a rhythm in kneading dough, a satisfaction in organizing the sparse pantry, a small joy in the scent of baking bread that filled the small rooms and seemed to push back against the vast emptiness outside. She did it not out of obligation, but as a way of saying thank you in a language Cole might understand. Words were a currency they traded in sparingly. Instead, she mended a tear in Jessie's shirt. She ensured a hot meal was ready when Cole returned, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. These small acts were her way of earning her keep, of putting down fragile roots in this temporary haven. Jessie became the bridge between them. He was a bright, talkative boy, his questions a constant stream that filled the silences Cole left behind. He followed Ada around the house, watching her with an open curiosity. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch darning a sock, he showed her a tangled piece of rope. "Cole says I tie knots like a drowning man," he said with a frown. Ada smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She took the rope. "Let me show you a trick my father taught me. A bowline. It's a good knot. It will not slip." She worked the rope with nimble fingers, her voice soft as she explained each step. Jessie watched, his brow furrowed in concentration, and when he finally managed a clumsy version of his own, his face lit up with pride. In that small moment, a piece of the hunted look left Ada's eyes, teaching the boy. She was not a fugitive. She was just a woman on a porch, sharing a simple piece of knowledge. Cole observed these changes from his usual distance. He saw the way Jessie had started to orbit the woman, the way the house felt warmer, more alive. He noticed the cushion she had made from a folded grain sack and placed on the hard wooden chair she favored. He saw the neat stack of firewood she kept by the hearth. He said nothing. But one evening, after a cold wind had kicked up and made the window in her room rattle all night, she found he had tightened the latch and wedged a small piece of leather into the frame to silence it. It was his version of a conversation, a quiet acknowledgement that he saw her, that her comfort mattered. The fragile peace was always shadowed by the threat that had driven her there. Sometimes, a dust devil in the distance would make her heart leap into her throat, her mind instantly seeing a posse of riders. A sharp noise would make her spin around, her hands clenched. She was a prisoner of her own fear, and she fought against the feeling of being a burden, a danger brought to this quiet place. One evening, after Jessie had been put to bed, she and Cole sat at the small kitchen table. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp that cast long dancing shadows on the walls. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Ada slid the worn leather ledger onto the table. "You have a right to know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You should know the risk you have taken." Cole looked at the book but did not touch it. He just waited, his gaze steady. "My father was a surveyor," she began, her eyes fixed on the ledger as if it held the whole story. "He believed in maps. He believed that lines on paper meant something, that they promised a man the right to his own piece of land." She explained how her father had worked for the settlers in the Verde Valley, charting their small claims, the homesteads they had poured their sweat and hopes into. But the railroad was coming, and Barlow Kane's corporation wanted that land, the land with the best water rights. They made offers that were insults. When the settlers refused, accidents started to happen, fences cut, wells fouled. Her voice grew tight. My father had all the proof. He had the original surveys, the sworn statements. He documented everything in that book. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And then Cain made a different kind of offer. To my uncle, after my father passed. An arrangement, a marriage to his business partner, a man who was meant to control me, and through me, control my father's legacy. She did not need to detail the cruelty of the man or the fear that had been her constant companion. It was there in the shadows under her eyes, in the persistent tremor in her hands. The ledger was supposed to be my dowry, proof of ownership to be handed over and burned. I knew I could not let that happen, so I ran. Cole finally looked down at the ledger, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. He was a man who had sworn an oath to himself to never again pick up a gun for another person's fight. He had seen where that led. It led to graves and ghosts. But listening to her story, he felt the foundations of that oath begin to crack. This was not a fight between two armed factions. This was a wolf circling a flock of sheep, and he had given one of the sheep shelter. "These people?" he asked, his voice rough. "Their names are in that book." "All of them," she said, "and a map. A map showing how Cain's railroad illegally rerouted a creek to dry them out. It's all there, but without a witness, a person of authority to present it. It is just paper." Inside the ledger, tucked between two pages, was a single, pressed wildflower, a tiny splash of purple, fragile and yet stubbornly vibrant, a sliver of hope she had carried with her out of the desert of her old life. Cole said nothing more. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. The matter was settled. The risk was now his as well. The conversation was over. A few days later, a storm rolled in, one of those violent desert squalls that appeared without warning. The wind howled, throwing dust and rain against the little house. Cole was out securing the barn, and Jesse was in his room, reading a worn dime novel. Ada was tidying the main room, the storm outside making her feel restless. She straightened the books on a small shelf, ran a cloth over the dusty mantelpiece. On the wall above the fireplace, held in a simple wooden rack, were two rifles. One was a new-looking Winchester, a practical tool for a rancher. The other was older, a Colt revolving rifle, its wooden stock dark and worn smooth with use. It looked out of place, a relic from another time, a more violent time. Compelled by an impulse she did not understand, she reached up and took the old rifle down. It was heavy, solid. It felt like it held stories. As her fingers traced the lines of the wooden stock, they found a small, intricate carving near the butt. It was weathered and faint, but the design was unmistakable. A coiled rattlesnake, and in the center of the coil, a single perfect star. The rifle suddenly felt cold in her hands. Her breath caught in her chest. She saw not the dusty room, but the cramped, hot rail car. She saw a grimy hand reaching for Cole's duster. She saw a flash of wrist, and a brand burned into the skin, a coiled rattlesnake with a star in its eye. MacDoran, the man hunting her, the man Cole had faced down with nothing but a cold stare, was part of Cole's past. The shield he had offered her was tainted with the very thing she was running from. The quiet, solitary rancher who had sworn off guns and trouble had once ridden with them. This sanctuary was not as safe as she had thought, and the man she was just beginning to trust was a far more complicated and dangerous man than she had ever imagined. She placed the rifle back in its rack, her movements stiff, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The storm raged outside, but a far more terrifying storm had just broken loose inside the small adobe house. The discovery of the rattlesnake brand sat like a stone between them. In the days that followed the storm, the air in the small house was clear and thin, but thick with unspoken questions. Ada found herself watching Cole, searching his quiet profile for some sign of the man who had worn that mark. She saw the calloused hands that could be surprisingly gentle when mending a leather strap for Jesse, the steady eyes that missed nothing, the deep weariness in his shoulders at the end of the day. But she could not reconcile that man with the ghost of a raider, a man who had ridden with the likes of MacDoran. She did not ask him about it. To ask the question was to pull the pin on something she was not sure she could survive. And so, A fragile, watchful silence took root. The attack came on a Tuesday morning, under a sky so painfully bright and blue it seemed to mock the very idea of violence. The day had started like any other. Cole was in the corral with Kino, a wiry, sun-cured man whose loyalty to the Maddox name stretched back to Cole's father. Kino had worked this ranch for 30 years, his face a leathery testament to a life spent squinting at the sun. He had stayed on after the elder Maddox passed, a quiet, steadfast presence who understood Cole's need for solitude. He was showing Cole a new cinch he had braided when the first rifle shot cracked through the morning stillness. The sound was sharp, definitive. It was not the sound of a hunter. It was the sound of a message. Splinters exploded from the top rail of the corral fence, inches from Cole's head. Both men dropped instinctively, the years of their respective lives teaching them the same brutal lesson when you hear a shot like that. You do not look. You move. "Riders," Kino hissed, his eyes scanning the low ridge that overlooked the ranch. 4 of them, spread out. Another shot kicked up a puff of dust by Cole's boots. He was pinned down, armed with only the pistol at his hip, his Winchester back at the house. He risked a glance toward the porch. Jesse had been sitting there, carving a piece of wood. The boy was frozen, his face a mask of white terror. Ada stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. "Jesse, get inside," Cole roared, his voice a raw command that cut through the boy's fear. Jesse scrambled backward, crab walking into the house just as a bullet slammed into the doorframe where he had been a second before. Cole felt a cold fury mix with the dread in his stomach. This was not a warning. They were shooting at a child. He had tried to outrun his past, to build a sanctuary so remote and quiet that trouble would forget his name. But trouble had a long memory, and it had found his address. "They're trying to flush us out," Cole said to Kino, his voice low. "Keep their heads down." Kino nodded, already pulling the old Sharps rifle he always carried in a scabbard on his saddle. He was a ranch hand, not a gunfighter. But in this land, the two were often the same thing. He settled behind a water trough, the long barrel of the rifle resting on its edge. Cole saw his chance. He broke from the cover of the corral, running in a low crouch toward the house. It was a 50-yard dash across open, sun-baked ground. He was a clear target. A rifle cracked from the ridge, and he felt a searing, white-hot pain graze the side of his head. The impact spun him around, and he fell, the world turning into a dizzying blur of blue sky and brown earth. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs, a warm stickiness already matting his hair. Inside the house, Ada had pulled Jesse away from the door, pushing him down behind a heavy wooden chest. Her heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs. She saw Cole go down. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was dead, but then she saw him move, trying to push himself up, his movements sluggish. The men on the ridge saw it too. 2 of them started down the slope, moving with a confident swagger, no longer bothering with cover. They thought the fight was over. They thought all they had to do was walk in and take what and who they came for. Panic seized Ada. She looked around the room, her eyes wild. She was trapped. Jesse was trapped. Cole was wounded and exposed. The world had shrunk to this one small, indefensible room. The feeling of being hunted, the feeling she had lived with for months, returned with a suffocating force. But then she looked at Jesse, his small body trembling, his face buried in her skirts, and something inside her shifted. It was one thing to be hunted herself. It was another thing entirely to stand by and watch them harm a child. Her gaze fell on the gun rack above the fireplace. The new Winchester. Not the old, haunted rifle, but the one Cole used for his work, a tool. Her hands shook so badly she could barely lift it. The rifle felt alien in her hands, heavy and cold and smelling of oil and death. She had never fired a gun in her life. The very idea of it terrified her. She remembered her father telling her that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. She moved to the window, her whole body trembling. She could see the 2 men advancing. One of them laughed, a cruel, ugly sound that carried on the still air. He was pointing toward the house, He was pointing at her, at Jessie. She rested the barrel on the windowsill to steady it. She pulled back the hammer with a clumsy thumb. The click sounded deafeningly loud in the small room. She closed her eyes, took a ragged breath, and aimed not at the men, but at the ground a few feet in front of them. Then she squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force that sent a jolt of pain through her. The room filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, but she did not drop the gun. She worked the lever, the motion stiff and unfamiliar, chambering another round. She fired again. The bullets kicked up dirt, forcing the two men to dive for cover. The laughter stopped. Their confident advance had been broken by the one thing they had not expected: resistance from inside the house. Her shots gave Cole the time he needed. He staggered to his feet, blood running down the side of his face, the world still tilting at a precarious angle. He made it to the porch, falling into the cover of the adobe walls, his pistol finally in his hand. From the barn, Kino's sharps boomed, a deep-throated roar that was far more authoritative than Ada's panicked shots. One of the riders on the ridge cried out and clutched his arm. The fight had changed. It was no longer a simple turkey shoot. They were bleeding, and the ranch was fighting back. The men exchanged a few more half-hearted shots before their nerve broke. They scrambled back to their horses and retreated over the ridge, leaving nothing behind but the lingering smell of gunpowder and a profound, ringing silence. No one moved for a long time. The adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving a shaky, hollow feeling in its place. Jessie was the first to stir, looking up at Ada with wide, awestruck eyes. She slowly lowered the rifle, her arms aching, and slid to the floor, her back against the wall, her body finally surrendering to the terror she had held at bay. Cole came in, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Blood was caked in his hair and traced a dark path down his cheek and neck. He looked at Ada, sitting on the floor with the Winchester across her lap, and then at Jessie, who was safe. His expression was impossible to read. Kino came over from the barn. "They're gone for now," he said, his voice grim. "But they'll be back." He was holding something in his hand. It was a small, folded piece of paper already stained with dirt. "Found this where one of them was hiding. Must have dropped it." Cole took the paper and unfolded it. The writing was a hasty scrawl. Pike, Dry Bell Saloon, Friday. Cole stared at the name. Sheriff Pike. The law in Dry Bell was on Barlow Kane's payroll. There was no one to run to, no authority to appeal to. They were utterly, completely on their own. He looked at Ada, at Jessie, at the bullet hole in his own door. He had tried to hide from the world, to build a life separate from the violence of men. But he saw now that his fence was not a wall. It was a cage. He had not protected them. He had trapped them here with him. His past had not just found him. It had made his home its new hunting ground. Later, after Kino had ridden off to watch the trail, the quiet of the afternoon settled back over the ranch. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was heavier, laced with the memory of the attack and the certainty of more to come. Ada found Cole sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey and a rag in front of him. She came with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He did not protest. He sat still as she gently cleaned the wound on his head. It was a nasty gash, shallow but bloody. Her fingers were surprisingly steady as she worked, her touch light. The room was silent except for the soft splash of water and the hiss of whiskey as she poured a little on the cloth to clean the wound. He winced, but did not pull away. The small act of tending to him was an intimacy that transcended words. It was an acknowledgement of the violence they had shared, and the fragile trust that had, against all odds, survived it. His blood was on her hands now, and she had fired a gun to protect his home. They were bound together by something more than a chance meeting on a train. When she finished, her hand lingered for a moment on his shoulder. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. In his gaze, she did not see the ghost of a raider. She saw a man who was wounded and tired, and who had just seen his carefully constructed world shot to pieces. She saw the immense weight of the fight to come. He reached up and took her hand. his thumb gently rubbing the back of it where the skin was bruised from the rifle's recoil. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. It was not a gesture of passion, but of gratitude, of connection, a silent admission that they were in this together. "You were brave today, Ada," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I was scared," she whispered, her throat tight. "I know," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you do what has to be done anyway." She did not pull her hand away. In that quiet moment, with the smell of blood and whiskey in the air and the threat of an enemy gathering just beyond the horizon, the fear did not disappear. But for the first time, she felt like she was not facing it alone. The decision to go to Drybell was a calculated risk, a deliberate step out of the shadows and into the wolf's den. They left Jesse with Kino, a silent understanding passing between the two men. Kino would watch the boy and the trail, his old Sharps rifle never far from his hand. The ride into town was tense. Cole's eyes were constantly moving, scanning the horizon, reading the landscape for any sign of a threat. Ada rode beside him, the precious ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep inside a saddlebag. On her finger, she wore a thin, cheap ring of tarnished brass, a relic from the sham of a marriage she had fled. It felt cold against her skin, a constant, metallic reminder of what she was fighting against. It was a scar she had not yet found a way to remove. Drybell was not a town. It was a company asset. The dust of the main street was the same, the sun as unforgiving, but the railroad's presence was a palpable force. The saloon was larger, the general store better stocked, and the sound that dominated the air was not the jingle of spurs, but the rhythmic, percussive clang of a blacksmith's hammer from the rail yard at the edge of town. It was a sound of relentless industry, a beat that said things were being forged here, whether they be iron rails or the fates of men. Justice, Ada thought, also needed to be forged, beaten into shape with heat and pressure. Their first stop was the office of Sheriff Pike. The man behind the desk matched the name on the note. He was thick in the middle, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His badge was polished to a high shine, but it did little to distract from the soft, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well now," Pike said, leaning back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "What can I do for you folks?" Ada stepped forward, placing the ledger on his desk. "Sheriff, I am here to file a grievance on behalf of the homesteaders of the Verde Valley. This book contains evidence of land and water theft by the Barlow Corporation." Pike did not touch the ledger. He looked from Ada's earnest, determined face to Cole's stony, watchful one. Cole stood by the door, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip, his presence a silent, non-negotiable warning. "That's a mighty serious accusation, miss," Pike said, his smile tightening. "Land disputes are a matter for the district court. The circuit judge isn't due through these parts for another month, maybe 2. He was a wall of bureaucratic indifference, designed to wear people down, to make them give up. "This cannot wait a month. Sheriff," Ada insisted, her voice steady. "Lives and livelihoods are at stake. I wish to have this evidence officially entered into the town's records, to have it witnessed and protected." "Protecting evidence is my business, of course," Pike said smoothly. "But the paperwork has to be in order. Tell you what, you leave it with me. I'll lock it up safe and sound, and I'll look it over when I get a spare moment." The offer was a trap. Leaving the ledger with him would be the same as throwing it into a fire. Cole spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. "We will hold on to our property, Sheriff, but we need to see the town solicitor. Now." Pike's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he nodded. "Suit yourself. Mr. Hemlock's office is down the street, right next to the assay office, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. Hemlock is a stickler for details." The solicitor, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, was even less helpful. He paged through the ledger, his expression growing more and more distressed. He licked his lips, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting Barlow Kane himself to walk through the door. "This is highly irregular, Miss Grace," he stammered, pushing the book back across his desk. These are serious claims, but as legal documents, they are incomplete. There are signatures, yes, but no official seal. Without the stamp of a recognized authority, a magistrate or a man of the cloth who consecrated the original claims, this is just a diary, hearsay. I cannot accept it. Defeat felt like a physical blow. Ada's shoulders slumped. All those miles, all that risk, for nothing. The law, which was supposed to be a shield for the weak, was just another tool for the powerful. "May I have a moment?" she asked, her voice quiet, "to review my father's notes one last time." Hemlock, relieved to be ending the confrontation, nodded eagerly. Of course. Take all the time you need. I have to step out for my midday meal." He practically fled the office, leaving them alone. As soon as he was gone, Ada's demeanor changed. The despair vanished, replaced by a feverish urgency. She pulled a small vial of ink and a sheaf of folded paper from her reticule. "Cole, stand at the door. Do not let anyone in." He did not ask what she was doing. He understood. He moved to the door, his body blocking the view from the street, his attention focused on the sounds of the town. Ada worked frantically, her pen scratching across the paper. She was not copying the entire ledger. She was copying the most crucial page, the hand-drawn map showing the illegal diversion of the creek, and the list of names of the families who had been cheated. It was a desperate, flimsy defense, a ghost of the original proof, but it was better than nothing. While Ada worked, Cole felt the atmosphere on the street shift. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was a steady heartbeat, but beneath it, he sensed a change in the town's rhythm. A few too many men were lingering on the boardwalk opposite. He saw a face he recognized from the attack on the ranch. "Ada," he said, his voice low, "we need to go, now." She quickly blotted the last page, folded the copies, and tucked them into her dress. They left the solicitor's office and stepped back into the oppressive heat. The town felt different now, hostile. They had made their move, and the enemy was making its own. "I need a drink," Cole said, his eyes scanning the street. "Wait for me at the livery. Keep out of sight." It was a pretext. He needed to draw the trouble to him, to keep it away from her. He pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Dry Bell Saloon. The place was dim and smelled of stale beer and desperation. He ordered a whiskey and stood at the bar, his back to the wall, watching the room in the mirror. He did not have to wait long. Mac Doran slid onto the stool next to him. He looked just as he had on the train, lean and predatory, but today there was a smug confidence in his eyes. "Maddox," Doran said, his voice a low drawl. "I had a feeling that was you. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." Cole did not look at him. He just stared at his own reflection in the grimy mirror. "I do not know you," he said, his voice flat. Doran laughed, a humorless sound. "You cannot burn off the brand and pretend you never wore it. Cole, we both know what you are, and we both know you still owe a debt from that business in San Saba." The name hung in the air between them, thick with the ghosts of dead men and bad blood. Cole's hand tightened around his whiskey glass. He could feel the familiar, cold rage beginning to build inside him, the instinct that had kept him alive for so long, the part of him that knew how to end this fight before it began, with a single, decisive movement. But then he thought of Ada, of Jesse, of the quiet life he had tried so hard to build. He had made a promise to himself. He would not be that man again. "I do not pay old debts," Cole said. "Barlow Kane, he pays new ones," Doran sneered. "He wants the girl and the book. Give them to me, and I might just forget what you owe." Cole finally turned, his eyes the color of ice. "No." The single word was all it took. Doran moved, but Cole was ready. He was not a young man anymore, but his body remembered the brutal ballet of a brawl. He ducked under Doran's wild punch and drove his fist into the other man's gut. The fight was not about skill or finesse. It was about creating a disruption, about buying Ada time to get away. It was a storm of flying fists and grunts of pain. A table crashed to the floor. Men scattered, shouting. Cole fought with a cold, contained fury, taking 2 punches for every one he landed. He was not trying to win. He was trying to endure. He brought his elbow up, catching Doran under the chin, and used the moment to throw him through the batwing doors and into the dusty street. He did not follow. His purpose was served. He threw a few coins on the bar and walked out the back, his knuckles bleeding, his head ringing. He found Ada at the livery, her face pale with worry. She had seen the commotion from a distance. She said nothing about his bruised face. She simply handed him a piece of paper. It was a page from a directory in Hemlock's office that she had seen before the solicitor returned. Hemlock was right, she said, her voice tight with a new, desperate hope. There is only one man whose testimony could make the ledger legal, a priest who traveled with the first settlers. He blessed their claims. His name is Father Whitlow. Cole looked at the name, and then at the location she had scribbled beneath it, Coyote Canyon, a maze of jagged rocks and hidden ravines, a place where a man could disappear if he wanted to. He looked at Ada, at the fire that refused to be extinguished in her eyes. They had been blocked by the law of men, a law corrupted by money and fear. Now their only hope lay in finding a man of God, hiding out in a place that looked like a piece of hell itself. They left Drybell as the sun began to set, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer fading behind them, their journey taking them away from the world of towns and sheriffs, and deeper into the wild, unforgiving heart of the territory. The journey into Coyote Canyon was a descent into a harsher, more primal world. They left the familiar scrubland behind and entered a landscape of stark and brutal beauty. The earth cracked under the horses' hooves, and the sun beat down on monolithic rock formations that rose like the broken teeth of the world. They rode for hours in a silence born of caution and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the wilderness. Their path led them to the edge of a great salt flat, a basin that stretched for miles, a blinding white sheet under the relentless sun. It shimmered in the heat, a vast, cracked mirror reflecting the empty blue sky. To cross it was to make themselves completely exposed. Two tiny figures moving across a landscape that offered no shelter, no mercy. "We cross now," Cole said, his voice raspy with dust. "It will be night by the time we reach the other side. Will be harder to see." Riding onto the flat was like entering another world. The air grew still and tasted of salt and ancient dust. The only sound was the soft crunch of the horses' hooves on the crystalline ground. It was the ghost of a dead sea, and they were trespassers in its boneyard. The heat radiated up from the white earth, baking them from below as the sun baked them from above. Ada pulled her hat down low, her world shrinking to the sweat-stained neck of her horse and the straight, unyielding line of Cole's back in front of her. He seemed a part of this landscape, as weathered and silent as the rock formations they had left behind. She thought of the man he was, and the man he might have been, the man who wore the rattlesnake brand. She had seen the cold, efficient violence in him during the fight at the saloon, but she had also seen the gentle patience with which he taught Jessie to whittle, and the quiet way he'd braced her window against the wind. He was a man of contradictions, a man at war with himself. She felt a deep, aching connection to that struggle. Her own past was a cage she was trying to escape, a past where care and control had been twisted into the same ugly knot. She feared love itself could become another kind of tether, another gilded prison. Cole felt her watching him. He could feel the weight of her unspoken questions, the same questions he had spent years trying not to ask himself. He had built his life on a foundation of solitude, believing that any attachment was a weakness, a vulnerability his enemies could exploit. To care for Ada, to care for Jessie, was to give the world a weapon to use against him. It was a terrifying thought. Every mile they rode together, every quiet glance they exchanged, he felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble, and it scared him more than any gunfight. They were halfway across the basin when the sky began to change. A smudge of brown appeared on the western horizon, a bruise against the perfect blue. It grew with an unnatural speed, darkening, churning, swallowing the sky. "Sandstorm," Cole said, his voice tight. He had reined in his horse, his eyes narrowed against the rising wind. "We will not make it across. We have to find shelter." He pointed to a dark line of rock at the edge of the salt flat. Miles away. There, an old prospector's dugout. If I remember the map right, we have to ride. The ride was a frantic, desperate race against the approaching storm. The wind, which had been a hot whisper, was now a low moan, throwing stinging grains of salt and sand into their faces. The sun vanished behind a roiling wall of brown that seemed to stretch from the earth to the heavens. The world grew dark, an unnatural twilight in the middle of the afternoon. They reached the rocks just as the storm hit, a solid, screaming force that threatened to tear them from their saddles. Cole found the dugout, a forgotten wound in the earth, half hidden by a rockfall. It was little more than a cave, dug into the side of a hill, with a few rotten timbers shoring up the entrance. He half dragged, half pushed the terrified horses into a small, sheltered alcove in the rocks and then pulled Ada into the darkness of the dugout. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the wind, a physical pressure that made the very air in the small space vibrate. It was a complete and utter blackness, thick with the smell of dust and time. Cole fumbled in his saddlebag, his hands finding a lantern and a match. He struck the match, the tiny flare of light a defiant miracle against the overwhelming dark. He lit the lantern, and a small circle of wavering, golden light pushed back the shadows. It was a single, defiant spark against the rage of the storm, a fragile anchor in a world that had come undone. They sat on the hard-packed earth, shoulders almost touching, listening to the tempest. The storm was a wild beast, trying to claw its way into their sanctuary. The minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The constant, deafening roar was a physical assault, fraying their nerves, stripping away everything but the raw, immediate present. The temperature dropped, the desert night bringing a sudden, biting chill. Ada began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that was born of more than just the cold. It was the fear, the exhaustion, the constant, grinding tension of the past weeks finally breaking through her resolve. Cole saw her shivering. He took off his heavy duster, the same one that had hidden her on the train, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The canvas was still warm from his body and smelled of leather and dust and him. She pulled it tighter, but the shaking would not stop. In the flickering light of the lantern, their faces were landscapes of shadow and gold. The fight, the fear, the journey, all of it was etched there. All the questions they had not asked, all the things they had not said, hung in the small space between them. Ada looked at him, her eyes luminous with unshed tears in the dim light. She had spent so long running, so long being strong because she had no other choice. But here, in the heart of the storm, her strength finally gave out. She needed an anchor. She needed a truth to hold on to in the howling darkness. Her voice, when she spoke, was a fractured whisper, almost lost in the shriek of the wind. "Tell me I am yours." It was not a request. It was a plea, a desperate cry for a place to belong, for a moment of peace in a life that had offered her none. It was an act of ultimate trust and ultimate vulnerability. Cole's breath caught in his throat. He looked into her eyes and saw all her fears, and they mirrored his own. To claim her was to bind himself to her fate, to make himself vulnerable, to abandon the solitude that had been his only shield for so long. The man he used to be, the Cimarron raider, would have laughed and walked away. But that man was a ghost. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently touching her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she had not realized had fallen. He leaned closer, his voice a low rumble, meant for her ears alone against the roar of the world. "Forever, Angel." He said the words, and in saying them, felt the last of his old walls turn to dust and blow away in the storm. He lost himself in her warmth, in the simple, profound truth of her presence beside him. He let the heart he had guarded for so long finally, completely, surrender. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was a promise made in the heart of a storm, a quiet vow of shelter and belonging. It was two lost and broken souls finding a haven in each other. They clung together in the darkness, and the lantern light cast their single, shared shadow against the earthen wall as the world outside raged on. When they awoke, it was to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured and new. A sliver of dawn light crept into the dugout. Cole was already awake, watching her. In the clear morning light, nothing and everything had changed. The fear and the danger were still there, waiting for them. But they were no longer facing it alone. They found Father Whitlow 2 hours later, in a small, hidden canyon where a trickle of spring water gave life to a stubborn patch of green. He was not what Ada had expected. He was a tall, gaunt man with a wild shock of white hair and eyes as clear and sharp as a hawk's. He was wiry and tough, his skin tanned to the color of old leather, his priest's collar looking out of place on a man who looked more like a prospector than a preacher. He listened to her story without interruption, his gaze moving from her earnest face to the ledger she placed on his rough-hewn table. He paged through it slowly, his gnarled finger tracing the names of the families he had known, that he had prayed with. When she was finished, he closed the book. "I remember these people," he said, his voice a low rasp, as if sanded down by years of wind and prayer. "I remember the hope they had. Barlow Kane is a man who serves no God but Mammon. What you are doing is a righteous thing, child." "Will you help us?" Ada asked, her voice tight with hope. "Will you testify that these claims are true?" Father Whitlow looked out at the canyon, at the unforgiving land he had made his parish. "I will," he said, his gaze returning to them, sharp and penetrating. "But you must be careful. I have a visitor, once a month, a man from Drybell who brings me supplies. I have seen him speaking with men from the railroad camp. I do not trust him. There is a leak somewhere in your bucket, a traitor in your midst." Father Whitlow's warning echoed in the silence of the ride back from the canyon. "A traitor in your midst." The words were stones in Cole's gut. The stark, open country, which had felt like a refuge, now seemed menacing. Every shadow a potential threat, every distant rider a possible enemy. He rode with a new, cold watchfulness, his gaze sweeping not just the horizon, but the face of the woman beside him. Not from suspicion of her, but from a sickening awareness of how fragile their sanctuary truly was. Ada felt the change in him, a coiling tension that had replaced the quiet warmth that had grown between them in the storm. The promise they had made, a whisper against the wind, now seemed a fragile thing, threatened by a danger they could not see. They arrived back at the ranch near dusk, a sense of foreboding hanging over them like the purple shadows stretching from the mesa. The sight of Jesse running out to meet them, whole and safe, was a profound relief that did little to ease Cole's inner turmoil. Kino was right behind the boy, his weathered face creased into what looked like a welcoming smile, but his eyes were haunted. "Everything is quiet here, boss," Kino said, taking the reins of Cole's horse, his hands, usually so steady, fumbled with the leather. "No trouble." Cole dismounted, his eyes missing nothing. The ranch looked the same, yet felt entirely different. Whitlow's words had poisoned it. He forced himself to nod. "Good. We will need to ride out again in the morning. All of us." Later that evening, as Ada was inside with Jesse, Cole walked the property, a ghost on his own land. He was checking the fences, the barn, the perimeter, but he was really looking for something that was out of place. Some sign that would confirm the dread coiling inside him. He trusted 2 people in this world besides Ada and Jesse. One was a priest hiding in a canyon. The other was the man who had just lied to his face. Kino was the only person who knew they had gone to Coyote Canyon, the only one who could have sold them out. The thought was a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. Kino had known him since he was a boy. He had been a constant, steady presence, as much a part of the ranch as the adobe walls of the house. Cole's search ended at the main corral gate. During the attack, a bullet had shattered the latch. Kino had repaired it. He had used a length of new rope, tying it off with a complex knot. Cole's blood ran cold. It was a diamond hitch, a knot used for securing a pack load. a knot Kino had taught him 30 years ago. But it was tied wrong, deliberately wrong. One of the loops was reversed, a subtle mistake that would not compromise the knot's strength but was a clear and undeniable signal to anyone who knew how to read it. It was a silent scream, a rancher's lie, a knot that said, "This looks right, but it is not. Danger." The truth hit Cole with the force of a physical blow. Kino had not betrayed them out of greed. He had been forced. The flawed knot was a desperate warning, the only one he could give. Cole found him in the barn, sitting in the darkness, his head in his hands. "They have your daughter, do they not?" Cole's voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a statement of fact. Kino looked up, his old face a mask of anguish, tears tracking paths through the dust on his cheeks. "Rosita, my girl in Tucson. Kane's men sent word. They have her. They said they would harm her if I did not tell them where you went. What could I do?" "Cole, she is my only child. What could I do?" "You did what any father would do," Cole said, the cold fury inside him now directed not at the old man, but at Barlow Kane and the world he represented, a world where good men were forced to make impossible choices. "You did the right thing by warning me." The next morning, they rode out before dawn, a small, grim procession. They had to go back. They had to get Father Whitlow, their only hope. Cole took Jesse with them. It was a terrible risk, but leaving him at the ranch now felt like leaving him in the heart of the trap. He belonged with Cole. As they entered the narrow mouth of the canyon, the air grew still and heavy. The place of hope had become a place of dread. Cole reined in his horse, his senses on high alert. The silence was wrong. There were no birds, no skittering lizards on the rocks. It was the dead, waiting silence of an ambush. The first shot was not aimed to kill. It came from the ridge above, striking the ground in front of Cole's horse, sending the animal rearing in panic. Then the trap was sprung. Men appeared from behind the rocks, their rifles all aimed at the canyon floor. Sheriff Pike was there, his face smug, his badge glinting in the morning sun, and beside him, a lean, smiling figure, was Mac Doran. "End of the line. Maddox," Doran called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I told you I would collect that debt." They were surrounded, outnumbered, with no cover. Cole's hand went to his pistol, but he knew it was hopeless. "I would not do that," Pike said, his voice casual. "We just want the girl and the book. You and the boy can ride away. We have no quarrel with you." It was a lie, and Cole knew it. He would be next. But for now, Ada was the prize. "Do not do it." "Cole," Ada said, her voice low and fierce. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Do not let them win." But there was no choice. To fight was to die. Cole slowly raised his hands. Doran and two of his men came down from the rocks, their rifles trained on him. Doran strode over to Ada's horse and grabbed her reins. He pulled her roughly from the saddle. "Looking for this," Doran said, reaching into her saddlebag and pulling out the leather-bound ledger. He then patted down her dress, his hands lingering in a way that made Cole's blood boil. He found the folded copies of the map she had made in the solicitor's office. He glanced at them, then sneered. "Clever," he said, "but not clever enough." He walked over to the small campfire that was still smoldering from their camp the night before and tossed the copied pages into the embers. They curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The flimsy ghost of their proof was gone. "The book goes to Mr. Kane," Pike said from the ridge. "Get the girl on a horse. We are leaving." In the chaos, as Doran was tying Ada's hands, Cole saw his only chance. A narrow wash, almost invisible from above, ran from the canyon floor into a tangle of rocks. It was a sliver of an opening, barely wide enough for a man. "Jesse," he whispered, his eyes locked on the boy. "When I move, you run. Run for the rocks and do not look back. Do you understand?" Jesse, his face pale with terror, gave a single, jerky nod. Cole kicked his horse, sending it charging not at the gunman but sideways, into Doran's horse. The animal screamed and collided. For a split second, there was confusion. It was all the time he needed. He dove from the saddle, grabbing Jesse and pulling him toward the wash. A rifle fired, the bullet whining past his ear. He pushed Jesse ahead of him into the narrow opening, scrambling after him on his hands and knees as the world erupted in gunfire. They ran, stumbling through the rocky, twisting wash, the shouts and shots fading behind them. They did not stop until their lungs were burning and their legs gave out, collapsing in a hidden alcove deep within the canyon's maze. They had escaped. But they had lost everything. Ada was gone. The copies were gone. The original ledger was in the hands of their enemy. They sat in the silence of their failure, the dust and despair a thick coat on them. Cole's mind was a black, raging storm. He had failed her. He had brought her into his life only to lead her into a cage. It was Jesse who finally broke the silence. He was no longer crying. His small face was set in a look of grim determination that was a startling echo of Cole's own. "I am tired of running, Cole," the boy said, his voice steady, devoid of its childish lilt. "She saved me during the attack. Now we have to save her." He looked up, his blue eyes clear and hard. "I am not a little boy anymore. You need help. I can be your eyes. I can go where you cannot. Tell me what to do." Cole looked at the boy, and in that moment saw the man he was going to become. He saw a courage that shamed his own despair. Jesse was right. This was not the end. Justice was not about a book or a legal claim anymore. It was about getting Ada back. It was about taking back their lives and their dignity from the men who sought to crush them. They made their way back to the ranch under the cover of darkness, two ghosts moving through a land that was no longer their home. The house was empty, cold. Kino was gone, likely taken by Pike's men to ensure his silence. They were alone. Cole walked to the fireplace. He reached up and took down the old Colt revolving rifle, the one with the rattlesnake brand carved into the stock. He had not fired this weapon in 10 years. He had buried the man who used it, the man who had ridden with Doran, the man who knew how to kill without hesitation. He had sworn he would never be that man again. He held the rifle in his hands, its weight both familiar and terrible. It was a part of a past he despised, a symbol of the violence he had tried to escape. But as he looked at the snake and the star, he knew he had no other choice. He would have to become that man again, just for a little while. But this time, it would be different. He was not picking up this gun for revenge, or for money, or for a lost cause. He was picking it up to save the woman he loved, to protect the boy who was his son in all but name. He was picking it up to fight for his family, and this time, he would not fail. The plan was born in the cold ashes of their last camp, a desperate piece of architecture built from whispers and shadows. Cole knew they could not win a straight fight. Cain had money and men. Cole had a boy, an old rifle, and a burning, righteous fury. It was not enough. To win, they had to change the battlefield. They could not fight Cain's army, so they would have to fight his reputation, his legitimacy. They needed a stage and an audience. Their first move was a perilous ride back into the maze of Coyote Canyon, not to the site of the ambush, but deeper, to the hidden spring where they had left Father Whitlow. The priest saw them coming, two weary riders emerging from the heat shimmer, and the look on his face was one of grim expectation. "They have her," Cole said, the words tasting like poison. "And the book," Whitlow added, his hawk-like eyes missing nothing. "I feared as much." "We are going to get them back," Cole stated. "It was not a hope, it was a vow. But I need your help. I need your flock." An hour later, they found them. The displaced homesteaders of the Verde Valley were camped in a box canyon a few miles from Whitlow's hermitage. They were a people hollowed out by loss, their faces etched with the same despair Cole had seen in the mirror for years. They had been scattered, their spirit broken. When Cole, a stranger with a gun on his back, rode into their camp with the priest, they greeted him with suspicion and weariness. Whitlow stood on a wagon bed, his gaunt frame a stark silhouette against the setting sun. "This man," he called out, his voice a clarion call that defied the dusty resignation of the camp, "offers not a prayer, but a chance. Listen to him." Cole did not offer them false hope. He spoke to them in the flat, direct language of the West. He told them about the attack, about Ada's capture. He told them about the ledger. And then he told them of his plan. Barlow Kane is taking a special train east in 2 days, he said. The information gleaned from a rider they had tracked leaving the ambush site. He's taking the ledger and a safe full of bribe money. He thinks he has won. He is going to pass over the new trestle bridge at Diablo Crossing, and that is where we are going to stop him. A murmur of fear and doubt ran through the crowd. Stop a train, one man scoffed. With what harsh language? With you, Cole answered, his gaze sweeping over their faces. Not as a mob, as witnesses. Justice is not always done in a courtroom. Sometimes it has to be done in the open, in front of God and everyone, where the guilty cannot hide. He laid out the plan, each piece a carefully placed stone in a foundation of desperate hope. Jesse, small and unassuming, would slip into the signal station a mile from the bridge and stop the train. Father Whitlow would lead them, the homesteaders, to the bridge to bear witness, and Cole would deal with the guards. It was Jesse's quiet courage that turned the tide. The boy stepped forward, his small voice clear and steady. They took Ada. She is our family. We have to get her back. He looked at the faces of the farmers and their wives, and they saw not a child, but the reflection of their own lost resolve. In that moment, the scattered, broken people began to remember that they were a community. 2 days later, a wind began to blow from the south, a hot, gritty breath that promised a storm. By midday, the sky was a bruised ochre yellow. A dust storm was coming. It was a brutal act of nature, and for Cole, it was a gift from God. Jesse reached the signal station, a lonely shack by the tracks, his heart pounding a rhythm of fear and purpose against his ribs. The signalman was asleep, a bottle of cheap whiskey on the table beside him. Jesse moved like a shadow, his small hands finding the heavy, cold iron of the signal lever. It took all of his weight, all of his strength, to pull it down. The mechanism screamed in protest, a long metallic groan, and outside the signal arm dropped. The track was closed. Miles away, on the newly constructed bridge that spanned the dry, rocky scar of the Diablo River, the train's whistle shrieked, a sound of surprise and fury. The locomotive ground to a halt, its great iron wheels screeching, the cars shuddering behind it. Barlow Kane stormed out of his private car, his face purple with rage, demanding to know the meaning of the delay. He found himself in the heart of a rising storm. The wind was a physical force now, howling over the bridge, whipping dust into a blinding, choking fog. Out of that roiling brown chaos, a figure appeared, walking down the tracks toward the train, a lone man with a long rifle held loosely in one hand. It was Cole. Maddox MacDoran snarled. Stepping out onto the platform between the cars, he drew his pistol, a look of genuine pleasure on his face. You just could not stay dead. The debt is not paid yet. Doran, Cole called back, his voice cutting through the wind. The duel was a nightmare of noise and confusion. The wind shrieked, the dust swirled, and the two men were ghostly figures in the maelstrom, their shots muffled cracks in the roar of the storm. They moved between the cars, using the train for cover, a deadly dance on a narrow wooden stage high above the riverbed. Cole fought with a cold, detached precision. This was not about rage. It was about purpose. Doran was a ghost from his past, and the only way to banish him was to face him. While the gunfight raged, Ada made her move. She was in the main car with Kane and a few of his clerks, along with a terrified young woman she knew must be Rosita, Kino's daughter. The great iron safe was bolted to the floor in the corner. Kane was at the window, bellowing orders that were swallowed by the wind. Ada saw her chance. A knife lay on a table, left from a meal. She palmed it, her movements hidden by the chaos. She moved to Rosita's side. "Your father sent me," she whispered, and in the girl's terrified eyes, she saw a flicker of hope. With a few quick, deft movements, she sawed through the ropes that bound the girl's wrists. "Run!" she hissed. "Get off the train, now!" As Rosita fled, Ada turned her attention to Kane. He spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he saw the empty seat. "You," he spat, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked in his waistcoat. But before he could draw, a new sound joined the chorus of the storm. It was the sound of voices. A great crowd of people was emerging from the dust, walking onto the far side of the bridge. It was the homesteaders, their faces grim, their eyes burning with a collective purpose. They were led by Father Whitlow, his white hair a wild banner in the wind. The sight of them, this army of the dispossessed, made Kane freeze. At that moment, Cole appeared at the end of the car. His face was bleeding from a fresh cut. But he was standing. Behind him, on the tracks. Mac Doran lay on the ground, his gun a few feet from his outstretched hand. He was alive, but defeated. Cole had looked down at his old comrade, the man who represented everything he had once been, and had made a choice. He had broken the cycle. The past was finally over. "It is finished, Kane," Cole said. Ada did not wait. She ran to the safe, the heavy iron box that held their lives. "Open it," she demanded of one of the terrified clerks. The man, seeing Kane cornered and the crowd of angry farmers on the bridge, fumbled with the combination. The heavy door swung open. Ada reached inside and pulled out the ledger. She held it high, her voice ringing out over the wind. "Is this the land you stole from them? Mr. Kane, is this the proof of your crimes?" Father Whitlow's voice boomed from the crowd. "It is we bear witness. Those are the deeds to our homes." Cornered, exposed, his power evaporating in the wind, Kane did the only thing a coward could do. He drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Ada. The crowd gasped. The world seemed to hold its breath. All eyes turned to Sheriff Pike, who stood near Kane, his face ashen. He was the law. For a long, terrible moment, he did nothing. He looked from Kane's gun to the sea of hardened faces before him. He was a man caught in the gears of his own corruption. Then one of Kane's own hired guns, seeing his empire collapsing, panicked. He shoved Pike forward. "Do something. Sheriff, this is your town." The shove, the desperate plea, was Pike's final undoing. It was a public admission of his allegiance. The townspeople who had been watching from the passenger cars, the silent witnesses to Drybell's long decay, finally found their voice. A low murmur turned into a shout, then a roar of outrage. The wall of fear and silence that Kane had built around his empire came crashing down. Pike, his authority shattered, his face a mess of sweat and terror, finally drew his own weapon and pointed it at his paymaster. "Drop the gun, Kane." Barlow Kane looked from the sheriff to Cole to the crowd. He saw no escape. His face crumpled, and the gun fell from his hand, clattering on the floor of the car. It was over. A federal marshal, who had been a quiet passenger on the train, stepped forward and took charge, his presence lending an official seal to the people's justice. The train was impounded. The safe and its contents were seized as evidence, and Barlow Kane, the man who thought he could buy the world, was finally in chains. The dust storm that had served as their shield abated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world washed in a strange, amber light. In its aftermath, the scene on the Diablo Crossing Bridge was one of quiet, stunned resolution. The homesteaders, no longer a mob but a silent, dignified jury, watched as the federal marshal, a man named Elias Vance, took Barlow Kane into custody. The power that had seemed as vast and unmovable as the territory itself had been broken not by an army, but by the truth, spoken aloud in a place where it could not be ignored. The weeks that followed were a slow, steady unknotting of the lies and corruption that had choked the Verde Valley, the territorial court. With Marshal Vance overseeing the proceedings and a ledger full of evidence, moved with a speed that surprised everyone. Barlow Kane's trial was brief. Faced with the unshakable testimony of Father Whitlow and a dozen homesteaders, he was convicted, his empire of paper and fear dissolving under the weight of his own greed. Sheriff Pike, stripped of his badge and his authority, faced his own investigation, a man undone by the public shame of his choices. Justice, it turned out, was not a single, dramatic moment, but a series of small, quiet acts. It was the day the new deeds were issued, the crisp paper in the farmer's hands a tangible symbol of their victory. It was the sight of wagons returning to abandoned homesteads, the sound of hammers ringing out as families began to rebuild what had been taken from them. And it was the day Kino returned. He rode into Drybell not as a traitor, but as a man who had come to make amends. His daughter, Rosita, was safe, and he channeled his gratitude and his shame into a single monumental task. The town's public well, long neglected and controlled by the railroad, had fallen into disrepair. Kino, with his own hands and a quiet, tireless determination, began to restore it. He dug it deeper, reinforced the walls with new stone, and built a new housing for the pulley. Men from the town, and then homesteaders he had wronged, came to help. The rebuilding of the well became a silent act of communal forgiveness, a testament to the idea that a community could heal itself, one stone at a time. For Ada, victory was not an end, but a beginning. The land returned to the people was only half the battle. They needed a future, on a piece of unclaimed territory, a gentle slope that overlooked the newly irrigated valley. She started a school. It began in a tent, with a handful of children and a few worn books, but it grew. Using funds recovered from Cain's assets and with the labor of the homesteaders, they built a small but sturdy schoolhouse that also served as a community hall. It became the heart of the valley, a place for meetings, for barn dances, and for learning. Ada, who had arrived in the territory as a fugitive, had become its foundation. She was no longer running from the past. She was building a future for others. Her voice a steady and respected presence in the very council chambers that had once been closed to her. The ranch, too, was healing. The scars of the attack were fading, the bullet holes patched, the broken fences mended. One afternoon, as Cole and Jesse were replacing a rotten post, Cole stopped and looked at the boy. Jesse had grown in the past weeks. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. He stood taller, his shoulders broader. "Jesse," Cole said, his voice a little rough. "A name is an important thing. It tells people who you are, where you belong. If you would have it, I would like you to take mine. I would be proud to have you as my son, Jesse Maddox." Jesse did not say anything for a long moment. He just looked at Cole, his bright blue eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. He gave a single, solemn nod, the gesture of a boy accepting the greatest gift he had ever been offered. In that quiet, sunlit moment, on a small patch of land they had fought for, a family was officially born. A few days later, Cole took the old Colt revolving rifle from its rack above the fireplace. He walked out past the corral, past the fields he and Jesse were clearing, to a place where a giant saguaro cactus stood, its arms reaching for the sky. At its base, a cluster of tough, resilient flowers bloomed, a defiant splash of purple against the harsh, dry earth. He looked at the rifle, at the rattlesnake and star carved into its stock. It had saved his life more times than he could count. It had been his companion in a life he now barely recognized. It had been the symbol of his sins. He had picked it up one last time to save the people he loved, and now its purpose was fulfilled. He dug a deep hole in the rocky soil. He wrapped the rifle in an old piece of oilcloth, laid it gently in the earth, and buried it. He did not say a prayer or a farewell. He simply turned his back on the grave of the man he used to be and walked away, a free man. The seasons turned. The harsh, dry heat of summer gave way to the promise of autumn, and then the winter rains came. It was a soft, steady rain, not a violent storm, a life-giving presence that washed the dust from the air and turned the brown land to a hopeful shade of green. One evening, they sat on the porch, the three of them, watching the rain fall. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and creosote. Jesse was on the steps, carefully carving a new piece of wood, the picture of contentment. Ada leaned her head against Cole's shoulder. She was home. The constant gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was the surest, most solid thing in her world. He looked down at her, his weathered face softened by the gray light. He covered her hand with his own. "Forever, Angel," he whispered, the words no longer a desperate promise in a storm, but a simple, profound truth spoken in the shelter of the life they had built together. She lifted her face to his, and he kissed her, a gentle, lingering kiss that held all the hardship of their journey and all the hope of their future. Behind them, the lamplight from inside the house cast a warm, golden glow. Cole put his arm around her, and together they stood up and walked inside, closing the door on the rain and the past, leaving only the quiet promise of the night ahead. In a harsh land, where life was a constant struggle against the sun and the soil, it was not the strongest or the most ruthless who truly thrived. It was those who understood that kindness was the real groundwater, the hidden spring that nourished the roots of a community and allowed hope to bloom in the most unforgiving of deserts. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.